Isn't that great? Like, I have a reason here because it's not going to allow us to flourish. But see, watch this. What's the underlying assumption that is begging the question? Why should anybody survive? Mm-hmm. Why is there any human value to the human race, or value to the human race at all? And the atheist skips that. He's image of God. He's suppressing the truth. And so he skips that major point. And so what they do is they want the assumption granted that human life is valuable, has dignity, and should be preserved. But see, that's the very thing that's being questioned. You see? Mm. And so when Wilson asks him this question, Barker can't see it. He can't see it. But you're going to hear how it kind of plays out here.
A person can be called morality, can be called moral, who intends to act in ways that minimize harm in the world. Okay?
You're allowing for accidents and that.
Yeah, because you might try and fail, or in fact you might not try and succeed, and you can't be accidentally moral, but and you might try your best and not have enough information and make the wrong decision. But as long as your intention is to act in ways that minimize harm, by definition you are called moral or ethical. And this is what morality means. When you're talking about morality, you're talking about how do we get along? How do we avoid harm? How do we avoid violence? How do we successfully navigate through this world that we bump into other things and other people as physical organisms? Because that's what we are. We are a mass of atoms fizzing, basically. But an amazing organization of that mass of atoms that is fizzing with no heaven above us. It's incredible.
So there you go. So notice. I want the assumption granted that you should preserve life and minimize harm.
Right.
But we're just a mass of atoms fizzing with no heaven above us, only sky. You can't bring those two things together. He wants just grant me this. Human value, life, dignity, we should preserve this, it's valuable. But you see, that's the very thing that's being questioned. And you haven't demonstrated as an atheist that there is inherent value and dignity and worth that should be upheld for the human being. You haven't demonstrated it because in Barker's system, all we are is stardust.
Right.
I've debated Dan Barker, had a discussion with him on the radio program, and he granted that we're cosmic broccoli. He granted that we're just stardust. And so there's just this internal conflict and contradiction between all that he is saying on one hand and then on the other hand, even in the space of just 15 seconds there.
Yeah.
In the space of just 15 seconds. Minimize harm, that is by definition why, and then we're just a mass of atoms fizzing. So,
answering your question about morality first. Morality basically means acting in ways that do not cause harm. And
so why? That's what I'm asking you.
Because
why?
By nature, physical organisms naturally recoil from harm. I already spelled that out.
No, I recoil from harm being done to me, but that's not morality. That's called a nervous system.
Yeah, but still, I know that's not morality, but you know that if you stick my hand in the fire, that my hand is, I'm probably going to feel the same pain you do. You know that I'm also a sentient physical organism in the same environment you're in. So, if I want to call myself a moral person, and there is no such thing as morality with a capital M. There is no cosmic thing called morality. It's a label that we use. And a lot of religious people make this mistake of reifying words. They think, oh, morality. How do we find morality? As if it were some big mystery. And a lot of churches have a lot of investment in keeping morality this big mystery, because then we need a code of commandments or some rules, or how do we do that, and come to my church and then I'll tell you how to do that. Morality is not complicated. It's simply acting in a way that tries to result in the least amount of harm in the world. You have to define what harm is, obviously, and then you also have to use reason to evaluate the various consequences, the relative merits of the various consequences of your actions, and say, well, as far as I know, this action will result in this one, so you're going to have to do a calculation. Right. The brain is a calculating machine. You're going to have to calculate. And based on what I know, I'm going to make this decision that results in the end with less harm in the world. That's what morality means. Morality doesn't mean flattering the ego of some sovereign God who wants to be worshipped and praised and told how good he is. How does that help morality? So, morality doesn't boil down to telling somebody how good he is.
So if there were a religious system in the world that repudiated the minimization of harm, or perversely adopted as one of their tenets of worship the maximization of harm to others, that would be immoral.
Yes, because of our common shared human nature.
Why should they listen to you?
Well, if they don't, we have systems of law and self-defense. We have ways of protecting ourselves from people that are mentally unhealthy who would try to act in that way.
So you'll harm them. You'll impose on them.
Well, I will only harm them as minimally necessary. I will not... Do you understand that? I will not impose the death penalty on someone just because God's will is offended. I will only say, in order to stop you from harming my family, I'm going to have to try to do what's minimally necessary, not out of vengeance or anger or out of whatever. I'm going to try to stop that harm from happening. That's why we have laws. That's why we have a government to try to enforce that morality.
Now, I understand a quarrel. Two animals could fight, two dogs could fight over a piece of meat, but it would be strange to have the dog stop and one say to the other, you ought to have let me have it because I was here first. The fight is simple to understand. It's simply, I want it, I'm going to protect myself, I'm going to do whatever is necessary to protect my own turf or food or whatever. But the morality is an appeal to a standard that's over the both. And when one person appeals to a moral standard, they're appealing to a standard that the other person or the other group or the other entity has an obligation to recognize as authoritative. If you simply say...
They don't have an obligation.
They don't have any obligation.
No.
So how is it moral?
Those of us who consider ourselves to be mentally healthy and moral have an obligation to minimize harm. That person has no obligation. There's no ought over that person.
Why do you get to...
Boom. Did you hear it?
Mm-hmm. He wants that gimme.
The gimme.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you press and press and press and press and press and you display, wait a minute, we're a bag of atoms, we're fizzing, you got two dogs fighting, they both want the same thing, they're fighting, and you're appealing to something that's above them. And then finally Barker will do this. He did this on the show with me as well. He just admits it.
Yeah.
Cosmically speaking, it doesn't matter what happens when Stardust bumps into Stardust. So it's almost like it's just it's just bluff and bluster, and then beyond that, it's just beating the air.
Yeah.
It's like the atheist wants to just say, minimize harm, minimize harm. You say, well, why? Where's the objective thing outside of you and your own personal preference? And he says, well, no, you don't have to. You're not obligated. You don't have to.
That reminds me, in the table talk I read the other day, I'll go ahead and read the last part. It's perfect for this. It says, human beings have a universal sense of oughtness. We know that we ought to meet certain standards. We know that we ought to be better than we are. And so we are always trying to improve ourselves morally, physically, spiritually, and so forth. This oughtness testifies to the universal knowledge that there is a transcendent standard that we fail to meet. And we share the gospel, or as we share the gospel, we should point to this sense in order to help people understand their guilt before God.
There you go. So here's what's really important as we do this in an apologetic sense. Notice what Wilson does there. He does not maneuver off of his basic commitment to Christ as Lord. He is assuming the Word of God and God's transcendent character and everything else as he moves forward. But as he approaches the unbelieving worldview, he's confronting the very foundations. Barker won't even touch it, but he does engage in an internal conflict where he says we're atoms, we're fizzing, there's no heaven above us. Then he says, well, you're not obligated, and there's no ought above any of us. And yet here he is spelling out oughts. You ought to minimize harm.
Yeah.
You ought to stop this. You ought to do this. Do you notice that? He said there's no oughts, but you ought to minimize harm. Do you see the dialectical tension that goes on there between what Barker says on the one hand and then the other? It's a demonstration of the collapse of the unbelieving worldview. But the problem is that someone like Dan Barker is such a sweet guy at times, and he's a very intelligent guy. He can sound very erudite. He can pull together complex strings of discussion and sound very complex. But the truth is, it comes down to you're just a bag of atoms fizzing, and you don't have any oughts whatsoever. There's nothing above any of us. And if anybody disagrees with that, listen to the discussion I had with him where I discussed rape with him on the show. And I said, well, ultimately, though, we're cosmic broccoli, we're Stardust. What's the problem with Stardust bumping into Stardust? And Dan Barker said, and if you're a fan of the show, you heard it every single time we played the show, at the beginning of the episode, what's the problem with Stardust bumping into Stardust? And he says, in the cosmic picture, nothing. It won't matter. You see, that's the point there. You push and push and push. And if Barker begins to say, well, I say so, point out to Barker, you told us we're cosmic broccoli in a universe that doesn't care. We're a bag of fizzing atoms. Your likes or dislikes are really ultimately irrelevant in the cosmic picture or in the ought picture, which you deny there are any ultimate oughts anyways. And if you say society is huddled together and decided on these things, well, then now you're in a real pickle. Because then you have no complaint against Stalin, Pol Pot. You have no complaint against Hitler because their society determined, I know it looks like a person. It's not a person. It's a Jew. We can kill it. Do you see the point?